Ease into it today. We have some Ethiopian Orthodox meditation music in the background here. Maybe we'll meditate with it today when we get into it. This is the recitation of St. Michael's homily. And once people tune in, we'll get into the mix with the real deal. I was up super late, just doing research and compiling stuff and all kinds of stuff. Downloading stuff, uploading to the Discord. For those of you who have ordered the Michael book, I have updates. They had trouble printing the Hebrew, maybe the Greek too, but they had trouble with the font, the Hebrew font, whatever. So I had to bring it back, and when I brought it back, I made some additions. So the new version, or I'm in the process of making some additions as I've been diving into this research. Figure give you guys a little more bang for your buck. So the new one, hopefully, the completed, I should say, revised, what have you, with the Hebrew fonts embedded version of the Michael book should go off to the printer, I'm hoping by the end of this week. And then usually, again, there's 7 to 10 days till it goes out. I'll post that in the Discord as well. I will post that in the Discord as well. Oh, it was a nice, easy way to start the morning. I like this. Hey, we got someone checking it out on Facebook. Welcome. It doesn't show me who's watching on Facebook, but if you smash that like button, it does. And then I'll know. Looks like I owe Ian Roberts a shout-out for a like. Is that my cousin-in-law, Ian Roberts? I have a cousin-in-law, Ian Roberts, who very well could be. That would be very cool. I know the rest of the crowd should be rolling in any minute because I think the Discord announcement's about to go out. Nope, not there yet. Not there yet. I'm going to keep bumping the Ethiopian meditation music. Oh, there's still 4 minutes left on the track. Sweet. Let me turn it up then until we really get going here. Yes. Beautiful. Yeah, I'm glad that I don't have to make the announcements anymore. I've automated that. Automation's coming in key. So this music we're listening to here is... I have part of the homily translated very badly, right? I was deep in the... you ever Google in a language you don't know? That's a whole thing, right? So I was Googling in Amharic last night. I don't know Amharic. I know English. And Google translates okay. It's not excellent. But so between the two, it was a whole challenge for me. Sorry, I'm playing with the music volume here. I'm realizing that when I change the volume for you, that doesn't change the volume for me. So I just need to make sure I'm louder, and I think I am. I think I'm a whole quantity louder. There we go, Twitch crowd is showing up. That's what I need to see. Didn't make the announcement yet in Discord, but I think it waits till I hit the 5-minute mark. I don't know how it works, honestly. I just trust the robot to do its thing. But whoever tuned in on Twitch, I guess the notifications went out is what it is. The Twitch notifications. Well, cool. So the music we're listening to here is the homily of Michael, right? So it's recounting the various miraculous deeds of the Archangel. And there's some pretty cool stories in it that, as far as I know, are unique to the Ethiopian Orthodox liturgy of Michael, right? I don't encounter them anywhere else. One particular one that I really dug, and I have a crude translation of it, and it is very crude. It's Google translated, and I haven't cleaned it up at all, but I would like to share it with you guys. Turn down a little here. So, I love this because it's so opposite the message that we get in every spiritual setting now about how to make stuff happen, right? It's like a classic tale about how you can't just pray. All right, so it says, "This is the text of St. Michael the Archangel, a mighty and glorious angel, read in February. May his blessings be with us forever. Amen. There was a poor man whose religion was strong. He prayed day and night. He said to St. Michael, 'Lord, have mercy on me. Give me food for the year.' But the man was lazy. He did not leave home to go to work. He would not work for even an hour. He didn't know business. After this, the Archangel St. Michael appeared to this poor man in a dream, and he said unto him, How can you say this? Am I a fool? Where's your wine? Where's your wheat? Where's your labor? Where's your labor? And the man says, my Lord Michael, have mercy on me. He says, you fool me, saying, my Lord Michael, have mercy on me. Where's your hard work? Didn't you hear that God, the father of all, is Adam? Oh, didn't you hear that your father is Adam? When he disobeyed the law of the devil, this is the land that you found, and you will return to it. Work and eat your bread. Did not the thorn bush sprout for you? After saying this, he went up to heaven. It goes on, but just that, right there, right? This man is praying to Michael to say, give me food for the year, and Michael shows up and says, what the fuck? Get a job, bro. I love it. I don't know why I love it so much. For some reason, we try to separate that stuff nowadays and say, well, no, I pray so I don't work. And Michael's first response is like, work. Where's your hard work? That's your lot, right? So early the next morning, the poor man got up and went to church to pray. He went to the temple, which was built in the name of St. Michael, to pray. St. Michael the Archangel said, be with me and do not separate me from me. When the man left the church, he met a rich man who feared God and gave a lot of alms to the poor and needy. And he said to him, Lord, have mercy on me, and I will give you 100 pieces of gold. I don't know the rich and the poor. Otherwise, bring someone to borrow from me today. And he said, give me back my money so there will be no strife between you and me. So he's arranging a very large loan of 100 pieces of gold. I have no one to lend to me, for I am kind to the poor and needy. And he said, if you will, I pray thee, let me go, I pray thee, to the church of St. Michael, the Archangel, for he is my Lord. The rich man said, if you believe in St. Michael, let us go, for also I believe in him. So this rich man and this poor man meet on the street, and they're going to go to the shrine of the Archangel together. Afterward, they both went to church and stood in the presence of St. Michael the Archangel. It's interesting because it says this poor archangel. So one of these men is an angel, I think. My Lord Michael, you have borrowed from me, for this rich man did not believe me. He said, I will return the gold to the rich man from now until the 12th day of the month of June, by the 12th day of the month of June. And he said to him, I have heard you. This is a wondrous thing for the rich man. After leaving the church, they both went to the rich man's house. The rich man gave him 100 times as much gold. The poor man took the gold and returned home happy, after which he went to Rome, where he traded in gold and made a lot of money. He was saddened to learn that the date of the feast of the Archangel St. Michael had arrived on June 12th, and that he would not be able to return home. He froze. He thought to himself, the time has come for me to bail out St. Michael the Archangel. Then he thought of the help of St. Michael and the Creator. He stretched out his hand to heaven and prayed. Faithful in his steadfast faith, he wrote to the debtor 100 times more gold, and in the sack he wrote the name of the Archangel St. Michael and the name of the rich man with them. Then he got up and went to the blacksmith and said, make me a blacksmith's box. He made a box for him, and then he took the bag and closed it. After this, on the eve of the feast of St. Michael the Archangel, he went to the river, stood on the shore, and Abune Zebesemayat praised God. With all his religion, Archangel St. Michael, as you have promised me, you know that today is the feast day of the rich man, and I am from a distant land. He went out and took the box and swallowed it. There's a fish that came and swallowed it. The fish then traveled 1 night, 6 months, and 6 days, and arrived at a port of Alexandria at sunrise. On that day the rich man ordered the archangels to go fishing for the feast of St. Michael, to cast their nets into the sea. And they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, there was no water in it. The rich man said to the boys, bring this fish to St. Michael for the feast. He ordered the boys to gut the fish. The rich man said, keep this box until we hear everything that has happened in our country and in the sea. A few days later the poor man entered Alexandria, and the creditor said to him, why did you do this to me? And he said unto him, out of thine own mouth will I judge thee, thou wicked servant. I said, where did you get your guarantor? On the eve of the feast of St. Michael, the Archangel Michael said, You know that you have borrowed from me. Behold, I have thrown him out of the sea." When he said this, the rich man thought about what had happened a few days earlier. And on the day of the Archangel, St. Michael commanded him to bring the box in the fish's belly. And he brought him, and took him by the hand, and lifted him up. And the rich man said, "Yes, my lord." He opened it quickly, and they found in his bag the name of the holy Michael, and the name of the rich man, and his name written. They found 100 times as much, and 50 times as much. For this the rich man praised the greatness of St. Michael's miracles and the presence of his God, and praised and glorified God. What is going on here with YouTube? Why are we doing this? I don't care about Call Your Miracle Child. And when did I get ads again? I thought I had YouTube Pro. For this the rich man praised the greatness of St. Michael's miracles, and the presence of his God, and praised and glorified God. The rich man said to the poor man, "Your religion is perfect." He said, "Truly you are a servant of God. I will not take this reward from you." The rich man took 50 pieces of gold from the money and made a gift to St. Michael the Archangel, to be for their memorial. From that day until the day they died, they remained friends, and remained in God's love. All this happened through the intercession of St. Michael the Archangel. May God teach us through the power of the prayers of St. Michael the Archangel, forgive us and keep us, all born of baptism forever. Amen. This is a miracle performed by the Archangel St. Michael. May his intercession be with us forever. It is said, so it's going to cut off on this one, I think. It is said that he was a good man who feared God. He was kind to the poor and needy. When Satan, the hater of the children of Adam, saw this, he became envious of him and struck him severely. He became paralyzed and seriously ill. He kept shouting because he was so sick. Because of the severity of his illness, he was unable to get out of bed. So he begged his relatives and neighbors to take him to St. Michael the Archangel's church. They took him by night without anyone's notice. As they asked, they took a picture of St. Michael the Archangel and placed it there, as they were asked. After that, the man began to beg and intercede for St. Michael with all his heart. "Remember me in your prayers before God, St. Michael the Archangel, and help me now. Save me from this terrible disease and save me." In the middle of the night, a great light shone on him, beating him on the chest with tears and strong sobbing. "Get out of this disease, for God has saved you from this disease. Behold, God has saved you and given you salvation." And when he said this, he stretched forth his hand and touched him, saying, "Arise and be gone." When he awoke, he got up and walked. The Archangel praises God, the creator of St. Michael. He bowed before the image of St. Michael the Archangel, praising him with words of complete joy. And when all the people saw it, they marveled and said to one another, "What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" They thanked him for telling him about his miracles. And they that saw it told them how it befell to him. That saved man did more good than ever. He did not hold back from commemorating the 12th day of the month until his death. He entered heaven through the intercession of St. Michael the Archangel, a messenger of kindness and forgiveness. May the glorious Lord, through the intercession of St. Michael the Archangel, save us from the death of sin, and hide us from the evil day of tribulation. Let us inherit heaven. Amen. So these are two of the stories. I got cut off. I only have two of the stories, really. There's, I think, 15 stories in the whole homily. Again, I don't have them all. Oh, we got people tuning in. Hey, everybody. I was just reading in the empty room. Let's see. Aaron Dank is here. Andy WMT. Eve AB. Freaky YOLO NR. Snow Off the Bluff. And What Do Mushrooms Look Like? Sweet. We got a good turnout. And an unknown stranger on Facebook. Dope. Well, I was just killing time till we got here. But we're clearly here. I got to get my my YouTube Plus going, I guess. But I think we can continue on yesterday's video without too much trouble, maybe. Get a new window going. And I don't think I need to sign up for the premium joint right now. Okay. And so yesterday, to bring us everyone back up to speed, now that everyone's here, we were watching Mitch Horowitz present at the Philosophical Research Society about the secret history of America. And so we'll pick up there. Man, I got a lot of Michael videos I gotta go through. Here we go.
To that.
So, framing things a little bit, we're kind of talking about Manly P. Hall, the research of Manly P. Hall into the strong influence of occultism, Masonry, and things of that nature in the founding of America. And I think in this talk, Mitch is going into more sort of just obscure bits of American history that were important. He was just talking about someone who was in the Roosevelt administration, who was Secretary of Agriculture, who was like a major occultist, and would talk about weird stuff in cabinet meetings. So from there, I think we're kind of just coming into this part.
When you see the Star of David, when you see the cross,
so he's talking about the power of symbolism.
The all-seeing eye, when you see the obelisk, when you see the pyramid, when you see the skull and crossbones, these things summon up from within an individual a kind of magnetic attention. We're drawn to them. We're drawn to them. And I think that's among the reasons why some of these symbols are so popular today within hip-hop culture, for example. So there are all these rumors that go around that, you know, Jay-Z and Nas and even Lady Gaga are part of something called the Illuminati because...
I don't know if I trust a guy talking about hip-hop who doesn't know how to pronounce Nas. I'm just throwing that out there.
They're using these symbols during Super Bowl halftime shows or what have you. But I think as artists, they really understand and really grok to the fact that these symbols possess power. They summon something from within us. They lift our energies. They focus our gaze. Some people make the decision, such as those who enter Order of the Eastern Star or Freemasonry, to study these symbols in earnest, but for others, they're just points of magnetism. And Wallace, I think correctly, had this instinct that this Freemasonic-inspired symbol on the back of our Great Seal had that kind of energy and should be brought into the public.
So he's talking about the eye in the pyramid that's on the back of the dollar bill. If you guys weren't with us yesterday, that's kind of where we left off. I think he makes a really critical point here, that just because someone uses a symbol doesn't mean they study the symbol. They might just feel the power of it.
So he brings this idea to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt is delighted with the idea and says, I'm going to do you one better. Not only are we going to put it on currency, but we're going to put it on the back of the dollar bill itself. And Roosevelt was so turned on by this idea that he personally supervised the placement of the Great Seal on the back of our dollar bill. And he did something very unusual. And these records actually exist in the U.S. Treasury Department, and I believe you can find them online as well. He, in his own pencil, in his own writing, working on a set of proofs of the new version of the back of the dollar bill, he rearranged the order of the Great Seal, of the reverse of the Great Seal, of the Iron Pyramid with the more familiar American eagle, so that if you take a look at the back of the dollar bill, you'll see that if there were like a dollar bill up here in front of us, you'd see
if only that were possible.
The reverse, the Iron Pyramid, occupies the dominant position, occupies what would be the position from which you start to first gaze at the bill. So it's in the more commanding position. He reversed it in terms of its order from where it originally was. It was originally in a lesser position so that it seemed to come second, so to speak, and he did an actual reversal. So it was the first place the eye was drawn to when you look at the dollar bill, and they decided that this would be...
I wonder if he doesn't know where the eye on the dollar bill is. It's on the left, and that's the point we read left to right, right? You start at the eye in the pyramid, and you read one across it, and you get to the eagle and the arrows.
The new way, the primary certificate of American currency would look, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, was entirely disgusted with this whole plan. He later complained in his memoir that Henry Wallace was part of some mystical cabal, and he got this crazy idea about the Iron Pyramid on the back of the bill, but Roosevelt was entirely sold on it. And so in 1935, while Wallace was still Secretary of Agriculture...
This is definitely not ancient history. It's 1935. It's after World War I. It's like the beginning of World War II.
Redesigned currency was issued, and for the very first time, mass numbers of people became familiar with this esoteric symbol that was at the heart of our founding. And one could say, well, Is it anything more than just a decoration? Is it anything more than just a piece of adornment? Does it really have any esoteric meaning? And I would argue that it does. I would argue that it does. Because not only is the symbol portentous in its own right, not only does the symbol contain within it a whole language that I think speaks to the mythical and the primal within us, but I think it captured, and it continues to capture, the best things about our society, the best things about our society, the things that have to be strengthened, the things that have to be tended to, the things that have to be watched over constantly. And that is, again, this notion of the birthright of the individual spiritual search, that which belongs ineffably to all of us. And the nation, in its earliest days, even going back to the colonial period, was known as a safe harbor for people with radical religious ideas.
And here we sit today, almost 200, a little more than 225 years later, having radical religious ideas with friends all around the world, though. That's pretty, I am pleased with that.
And it's contradictory, as so much in American history is contradictory, because during the colonial period and well beyond, you had the horror of slavery, which obviously went on and on deep into the 19th century, compounded by decades of Jim Crow and injustice after that, continuing to the present day. And you also had the destruction of the Native American culture.
I just realized you guys can't see this. Someone should have said something. I mean, it's just this guy talking about
crimes going on, but concurrent with that, you do have the colonies developing very early on a reputation as a safe harbor for people with radical religious beliefs. And as it happened, back in Europe, there was brewing, beginning in the early 1600s, just as the American colonies were taking shape, there was a tremendous backlash against some of the religious reforms and occult experimentation
there we go, guys.
that occurred during the Renaissance, especially after the death of Queen Elizabeth. Because in England, Queen Elizabeth was a kind of protector of people with occult interests. She had her own court astrologer, John Dee, who was later sort of disgraced and forced into exile after her death, and she was replaced by King James. And you also had, within the German-speaking region of Central Europe, the outbreak of a war in 1618 that became known as the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War had many different causes. There were many different reasons for its outbreak, but essentially it pitted Catholic armies against Protestant armies, and it grew in part out of a backlash against the relative religious liberalism and experimentation that had previously played out during the Renaissance. This area of Central Europe, this German-speaking area, which was more or less bookended by the Rhine River in the west and the Republic of Bohemia in the east, that was the springboard for so much occult and spiritual experimentation in Europe.
We still have that term Bohemian, right? Bohemian to mean like, I don't know. I get described as Bohemian all the time. Like, I don't know, beatnik almost, right? That's Bohemia. That's the same idea.
People were practicing alchemy and number mysticism and prophecy and divination and a whole range of beliefs that were considered verboten in other parts of the continent. And as a result of the 30 Years' War, that very experimental region of Central Europe was just decimated for generations. And as it happened, a number of the religious experimenters who dwelt there crossed the Atlantic and took up residency in the American colonies. One of the things you can read about in The Secret History of America, and I write about this as well in my book, Occult America, there was a mystical monk named Johannes Kelpius in Central Europe, and he existed sort of on the.
So, and I have to say, from like a folk magic tradition, where we see it like in conjure, is this is the how Braucherei comes about. Braucherei kind of gets described as Pennsylvania Dutch folk magic or German folk magic, but this is where it comes from, right? It's a lot of these people coming over early in this country's history when it's still colonies, and that's why it starts to bleed over in every magical tradition that takes root here. Because these Brauchers were already here doing their things in many cases. Many came later too. I'm not saying they came in one wave, but this is what these German-speaking mystics, and bringing the 6th and 7th books of Moses, and bringing a lot of these like classic books of conjure, if you will, or what would become classic books of conjure, bringing a lot of this very church-style folk magic, comes with a lot of these guys.
Far fringes of the Lutheran Church, and he took a band of maybe about 40 followers out of Central Europe into England. They made the journey across the sea and resettled in Philadelphia. They settled in the summer of 1694.
And so I'll say also, this is, again, from the folk magic tip, that's how you get, in Pennsylvania specifically, this kind of magic in Pennsylvania down the mid-Atlantic region, and then spreading slightly west, almost into the Appalachians. That's where you get a lot of this stuff coming through. The Hexenrei, Braucherei, and stuff like that.
Again, this is 100 years before the framing of the Constitution, roughly. They settled in Philly on the banks of the Wissahickon Creek. And Philadelphia, at that time, was considered a place, even though it was quite small, where people could freely practice their religions and engage in religious experiment. Philadelphia was founded by William Penn, who had been a Quaker, and Penn experienced religious discrimination at Oxford, even though he was part of a very wealthy family, and he was given a huge land grant in the American colonies, founding what became Pennsylvania, and he fulfilled a lifelong dream in creating the city of Philadelphia, which he named as the city of brotherly love. And his idea was that Philly was going to be a place where people could freely practice their religion without molestation or jailing or fear of persecution. And so Kelpius and his little circle, amazingly enough, heard news of this all the way across the Atlantic. They took the journey, they made it, they settled in Philly, and they founded this kind of monastic hermitage on the banks of the Wissahickon Creek in Philadelphia, where they practiced number symbolism, prophecy, divination. They believed that different tones of music could attenuate you to different qualities of the spiritual world. Now, he died.
I mean, this sounds a lot like what we talk about, right, guys? Does this sound very different from what we're dealing with? To me, it seems like the same thing, and I think knowing that was here in this country back then, and then that was like kind of instrumental to the founding of this country and the ethos of this country, makes me feel like a patriot right now. You guys should all feel like patriots right now. True, you guys are the true patriots.
About 12 years later from tuberculosis, but nonetheless, his commune was considered a successful social experiment, and other people heard about it and trickled across the Atlantic for actually many, many generations. The Shakers were a religious group that fled persecution in Manchester, England. Their founder, Mother Ann Lee, was a radical Quaker, and people started to call her group the Shaking Quakers. That's where their name came from, because they engaged in seances and things that we would call, channeling and mediumship, and they were accused of witchcraft. And Mother Ann rather intriguingly responded to her critics, "The only witchcraft is sin." And she led a band of about 12 followers across the Atlantic, settled in New York City in 1775. And they were poor folk, and they had to work very tough domestic jobs, cleaning chamber pots, cleaning chimneys, just to sort of scrape together enough money to survive. And the following year, they had pulled together enough money so that they were able to relocate up the Hudson River outside the city of Albany in a little village called Niskayuna. That was the Native American name. And they founded up there the very first Shaker village. And that too was seen as a successful commune. And Shaker villages began to appear in other parts of the country as far north as...
You guys want to start some Holy Mountain villages? Because that's definitely on my agenda. Let me know in the chat if you're down for that. Because I'm about this.
Maine and as far south as Kentucky. And actually some of the Shaker villages settled that particular swath of the country. And it's interesting, if you go up to the village of Niskayuna today it's called Watervliet. The name has changed to a Dutch name. But if you go up to the Shaker site at Niskayuna today, some of the original buildings are still there, and Mother Ann's grave is there, a very, very plain gravestone, just marked Mother Ann Lee. And I visited that spot, and it's interesting. You have to get your hands dirty when you're researching this stuff, because it's so interesting to go up there and see that this spot of land that the Shakers occupied, it's a really terrible, terrible spot of land. It's basically like a swamp.
Okay, I hope we do better than that.
Over in the winter. It's not very fertile. It's rocky. It's rooty. It's knotty. In the summer, when things thaw out, it reverts to being a swamp. It's mosquito infested. And it's almost unbelievable to think that this really very poor group of people who had migrated to escape charges of witchcraft in Manchester were able to relocate relatively safely in upstate New York. And they were absolutely wild. The Shakers, today, if you ask people about the Shakers, they usually know two things. They were celibate and they made nice furniture. And that's all that school kids get told. But the fact
if they get
is,
told anything, right? Did you guys hear about the Shakers? I might have heard about the Shakers. I don't really know. NyQuil's in. Snow off the Bluff's in. All right, team. Well, let's talk about this.
Shakers were real mystics. They would engage in things that we today would call seances and medium trances, and they would get inhabited by spirits and speak in tongues and go into ecstatic dances. And the paintings that they created, the murals that they created, the works of music that they created, they referred to as spirit gifts. And they said that they had been inspired to do these things as gifts from the spirit, gifts from the unseen world. And the Shakers were, in their own way, a very, very radical group. We could do a whole evening just talking about them alone. They did experience harassment. I don't want to paint an excessively rosy picture. One night, Mother Ann was seized by a mob, and she was disrobed because she was suspected of being a British agent during the Revolutionary War, because the Shakers were also pacifists. They would not fight in the military. So
that's the only thing I actually heard about them
against
in school, that the
and
Quakers,
put up with
the Quakers and the Shakers wouldn't fight in the Revolution.
Great deal of hardship, and yet she absolutely endured. She absolutely succeeded, and it's extraordinarily moving to go up to Niskayuna today and to see her gravesite. This simple gravestone, just with her name and her birth and death date on it. And this story, there are many such groups, there are many such figures. It repeated again and again through American life, because there was a feeling that imbued many parts of the nation or many parts of the colonies that the spiritual search was something that was protected, that was sacred, that was ineffable.
Hey, that's what we believe. That's what I believe. That's the basic philosophy of Holy Mountain. We'll jump back in there. Yeah, public school in Texas. Well, you know what it is? Because I'm from New Jersey, so I think it's like local. I learned it when I was learning, we learn a lot of colonial history because all that shit happened in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, all the major battles of the Revolutionary War and all that. So we learned a lot of that because it was okay, we're going to take a field trip to this battleground or whatever. But then again, I didn't really learn about like the Alamo or anything, which I assume you guys would have in Texas, right? Am I right, Desiree? I hope so. But yeah, what this guy's spitting right here is, I'm very pleased to hear, is exactly what I'm about, exactly what Holy Mountain's about. If you agree with him, you agree with me, you agree with this, you're definitely part of this. Creating a place, I mean, that's been the mission. That's come up a couple times in the chat, you know? And that's, I mean, if we have enough people, what do you say, 40 people? If we had 40 people and everyone was willing to throw down, we could easily get a sizable plot of land, and the rest of it is all pretty much figured out. So if we had 40 people, we could do, let's call it 50 people. If we had 40, 50 people, I think it would be cool. It'd be weird. I mean, that's for sure. We have a wide range of lifestyles, meaning like, I don't know, I'm a family with kids, and then we got people who are single partying. But if it's enough land, it doesn't matter. As long as we kind of come to certain agreements. I don't really like calling it rules. I like calling it agreements. Anyway, here we go. Let's continue.
Again, it's contradictory because there were all these criminal things going on at the same time, but there was this persistence. There was this kind of golden thread of protection for the spiritual search. And it's funny, I was speaking to a reporter today from the French newspaper L'Echo, and she wanted to write an article about the popularity of psychics back in New York City, where I'm from. And we were talking, and we were having a long and fruitful conversation, but she kept coming back again and again to this point she couldn't understand. Why do people do this? What is this all about? You know, back home in France, everybody thinks this is all a joke. And, you know, I kept trying to kind of explain to her that within the American character, or the best of it, within the best of the American character, there's this impulse that we're not so completely separated from the other world. We don't need an intermediary to guide us to the other.
That's interestingly particularly American. And I never really thought of the temple as a particularly American institution until now, but it actually, I'm like ready to get an American flag right now.
Other world. We don't necessarily need the man in the robes or a minister or a priest or even a medium to tell us what's what. There's a feeling that people have that, of course, everybody has their own commitments and everybody has their own way of viewing things. I can't overly generalize, but I would say that there is an ethic, there is a feeling that the individual has his or her own right to pursue some sense of inner meaning, internal search, some sense of individual agency that says, I am entitled by birthright.
I'll be honest here. I would agree. I have been surprised in my own journey how often I get into a situation where I have to tell someone what I do, and they ask questions, and they don't like burn me at the stake or anything. People continue to have conversations with me after it even. They're not like, all right, you're fucking crazy, we're done. It's very interesting. It's very interesting how that ethos pervades here. And I think, as he's pointing out, in parts of Europe and elsewhere, that's not, very much not so.
Entitled by birthright to search for something greater than myself, and that this something can be very practical, can be very therapeutic, can respond to my needs in the here and now. And I've had the experience of speaking with people from other nations in the West and in the East who have a great deal of difficulty wrapping their minds around what would seem to be very basic civics in the best iteration of our civics as a public society. My book, One Simple Idea, which is a history of the positive thinking movement, was translated in China, and the young woman who was translating it lived in Shanghai. And she too, I recall, as with this French journalist, had a great deal of difficulty understanding certain basic concepts that to us, I would say, are basic. I remember we were talking about Alcoholics Anonymous and the recovery movement, and how one of the central principles of Alcoholics Anonymous is that the individual needs to search for a higher power on his or her own terms, that no one can dictate what this higher power is, that it's up to the individual to engage in his or her own search for whatever it is and whatever personal conception that means to them. And I remember one time there was just dead silence at the other end of the Skype call, and her response was basically, "What are you talking about? What is this higher power, and what are you making reference to?" And concepts that are almost in the groundwater that we drink from can sometimes be very, very difficult for people from other societies to understand. And I think that's a positive thing. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. I don't care how much time I have to spend on the phone with the reporter from France or the translator from Shanghai. I never tire, perhaps unsuccessfully, of trying to explain what I'm driving at. It turns out, at the end of the day, when the translation of my book came out, the Chinese government censored about 30% of it. They cut out about 30% of it. So apparently I wasn't entirely persuasive to the censors, but I think that these concepts do represent something that is truly special and powerful about the best of American life, And this was something that Manly Hall understood when a lot of historians didn't, or a lot of historians would have been incapable of putting their finger on it. To most historians, Freemasonry, for example, would be nothing more than a glamorous footnote in American life. But Manly took very, very seriously how central this commitment was to some of the founders. And it is true that some of the major founders in the country were Freemasons. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, John Hancock, the Marquis de Lafayette, the French hero of the Revolutionary War. He got it. He was a French person who got it. So, but it really was an extraordinary list, and a very large subset of Washington's generals, of the signers of the Declaration, of the framers of the Constitution, were Masons. And I think that that's important, and that's unique, and that's meaningful. And Manly grasped this in a way that I think few other historians did. And there are ways in which Masonry has played out in American life that are not well understood. Another involves the African-American branch of Freemasonry that today is called Prince Hall Masonry.
I'm interested to see what he has on Prince Hall Masonry.
And there's increasingly close contact, I'm happy to say, between Prince Hall Masonry and the mainstream, the main branch of Masonry. Prince Hall...
but it's incorrect to call Prince Hall Masonry African-American because it was just black. Straight up, it was not only in America. It is inaccurate to call it African-American.
Hall Masonry was founded, and it's interesting because these dates were kind of off-key for a little while. It used to be thought that Prince Hall Masonry...
In fact, I'm going to just drop a little extra footnote on you guys. A lot of the Afro-Caribbean traditions, the Afro-Cuban, Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Haitian, these traditions, I guess it's just Haitian at that point, these traditions all heavily involved Masons in their founding. Like the people who founded these traditions were by and large Masons, Prince Hall Masons.
It was founded in 1775, but there are two Masonic historians today, Jim Hairston and Oscar Allende, who are just terrific. And they published a monograph recently that demonstrated with absolute authority that Prince Hall Masonry was founded in 1778. For years, the year 1775 had been perpetuated because somebody from the Massachusetts Historical Society, writing contemporaneously to that time, it was just a few years later, miswrote the date, wrote down the date 1775, and this was probably in the late 1700s. And since it seems like a primary source, it was quoted again and again and again, but no one ever bothered to verify or question the date based on the earliest minutes and meeting documents of Prince Hall Masonry. But Jim Hairston and Oscar Allende have done just yeoman's work historically, and they've demonstrated that Prince Hall actually goes to 1778. The name comes from the founder, the first Grand Master of the Lodge, who himself was named Prince Hall. He was a freed man of color, a leather worker who worked in the city of Boston. And he and a group of about 30 brethren got their own charter to start up a Masonic lodge, which they called African Lodge Number 1. And they were the first African-American Freemasonic group here in what at that time was still the American colonies. And it's very interesting. Prince Hall's name appears on 2 of the first petitions against slavery in American life. One petition is from 1777, and the other petition is from 1778. So one of the things I try to explain to people about Masonic history in America, and I want to make this point very, very carefully, it's not that abolitionism directly came from Freemasonry. There were many, many factors feeding into the cause of abolitionism. But, in effect, Prince Hall Masonry was the first black-led abolitionist movement in American life. The first black-led abolitionist movement in American life. Because when you crack open to people the idea that the spiritual search is their absolute birthright, you cannot close that door. You cannot close that door. Everything else starts to come in along with it. And the primacy of the individual as a matter of course flows from and follows from that. And that's why a lot of instances where you will find an upswing in occult or supernatural or radically ecumenical activity coincide directly with political reforms. Because as soon as the individual begins to identify him or herself as relating to higher forces, as possessing the ability to expand beyond the given, it's impossible for that person to ever see him or herself as open to subjugation again. They might not be able to physically escape subjugation, but internally, it becomes impossible to kind of keep that person in his or her place. And that's why again and again, you'll find that upsurges of occult activity and radical political reforms are always wed. They're always wed. For example, back in Europe and in France, there was the occult healer Franz Anton Mesmer, who arrived in Paris in 1778. And Mesmer told people that he had discovered this invisible ethereal fluid that animated all of life, which he referred to.
So Mesmer is where we get the word mesmerized. Mesmerism is his practice, and this is the idea of basically how we talk about pushing energy, right? We'll watch a few more minutes of this, and then we'll do meditation.
Referred to as animal magnetism. That's where the term comes from. And Mesmer's theory was that if he could put you into a kind of a trance state, he could manipulate your animal magnetism and cure mental illness or physical illness or any kind of maladies that you were experiencing. And here it was a few years before the French Revolution, and Mesmer began to amass quite a following.
And what I mean, his theories too are very much like what we constitute Reiki, right? Like energy healing, basically. Like a lot of what he was doing was trance Reiki.
Followers were political. Some of his followers were political radicals because they were very turned on, and listen to this very carefully, they were very turned on by the idea that if you could identify this ethereal fluid that animated all of life, it followed from that all individuals, regardless of bloodline, were essentially equal, were essentially the same. And it was not lost on people because at that time in France, at the dawn of the revolutionary era, at that time, everything was sort of cast into a political light. And it was not lost on people that if a commoner and an aristocrat, or if a slave and a plantation holder in the West Indies could each be placed into this kind of mesmeric trance, revealing these hidden energies that coursed through each individual, it was unavoidable to reach the conclusion of human equality. It was absolutely unavoidable. And this was very understood by people who were political radicals at the time on the French scene. And for that reason, Mesmer was held in great suspicion by King Louis XVI, and he disliked Mesmer very deeply because there were these rumblings that this man had discovered this occult or internal principle of life, and it completely struck at the foundations of the entire caste system. So King Louis decided to convene a royal commission to investigate Mesmer, and this
happens now. This is what will happen if we get land.
commission was chaired by Benjamin Franklin, who at the time was the American ambassador to France, and they issued their report, and they said, well, they had experimented with Mesmer's methods among different patients, and they found that there were some physical manifestations that grew out of mesmeric trances, some isolated cases of healings, but they all seemed to be, in the commission's words, in the imagination. And they stopped short right there. They stopped short right there on the precipice of their most significant question, which is, if it's all in the imagination, then why should anything be happening at all? Why are there physical effects manifested from the imagination? And what is this thing we call imagination anyway? They just didn't probe any further, and they left their most tantalizing question open and unresponded to. But undeterred was the Marquis de Lafayette, who actually became a student of Mesmer, became an apprentice to Mesmer. And after the Revolutionary War, in 1784, into Washington's second term, Lafayette decided that he was going to take a trip to America because he was specifically interested in some of the supernatural manifestations that were going on among the Shakers. And he wondered if their trance states and their seances coincided with the things that were happening while people were under mesmeric trances. And I came across a quote that I worked very, very hard to track down, where Lafayette appeared in the court of King Louis XVI, and he let him know he was going to be taking this trip to America to visit his friend George Washington. He didn't disclose to him that he was also going to be visiting Shaker villages so that he could research mesmerism. And King Louis teased him and said, "Oh, what will your best friend General Washington do when he discovers that you're an apprentice of this sorcerer Mesmer?" And I came upon this in this journal of German American history from the 1940s, and I thought, where did this quote come from? And I researched it and researched it.
Awesome.
And I found eventually that there was this multi-volume history of court life in France that was published by one of King Louis.
So he's just gonna 5222 is the pause time. I dig that. So I think we'll break here. He's kind of rambling and rumbling. Unless you guys are digging it hard. I say a couple more people have joined us. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Eve AB. Some other heads in here. We can keep going. A few more minutes. We started late, so I'm kind of... Let's give us another 15 minutes. That'll be about usual length, I'd say.
These courtiers who had survived the revolution. It was written in French across about 12 volumes. I get very hyper about these things. And there was the quote. There was the quote. He had overheard it or claimed to, and he repeated it. And so here is King Louis teasing the Marquis de Lafayette, saying, "What is your best friend General Washington going to think when he finds out you're a sorcerer's apprentice?" As it turns out, Washington already knew, and he didn't care, because there was actually, and this is in the Library of Congress, there was actually correspondence between Washington and this occult healer, Mesmer. Mesmer wanted to found a network of schools, and he called them the Society for Universal Philosophy, and he wanted to open some of these schools in the New Republic of America, and he wrote to Washington to ask him for his permission to do this, and Washington wrote back, in effect, saying, you don't need to necessarily ask my permission. You're perfectly welcome to do this if you want. The Marquis de Lafayette has described your theories to me, and if any of this happens to be true, then certainly this will redound back to you as one of the great intellects of our age. Washington always gave himself an out. He was very diplomatic. It's like, well, I have no idea whether you're a charlatan, but if it's true, it sounds great. And this obviously never happened. We don't have these academies of universal philosophy spread across the United States, but it was interesting that a figure who was regarded as very verboten and very occult in Europe actually had correspondence with George Washington. And I think the fact that Washington had a background as a Freemason made things like this possible, And there are other episodes in Washington's career and that in the career of other founders where at surprising moments, they would appear very, very religiously and spiritually open. And it was quite remarkable. And I think it's easy to underestimate the depth of commitment that Freemasonry represented for people at that time. Because back in the day, just after the War of Independence, the United States was a hugely rural agricultural place. There were very few universities, hospitals, libraries. Everything was more or less in private hands.
I'm going to throw him a like because he deserves it. Let me check in with you guys, check in with the chat. Yeah, I'm going to leave it up to you guys if you want to keep rocking with this. If you like American history, which was my minor in college, as I do, this is dope. If you don't give a shit, this is probably kind of boring. This is right up my alley. I don't know if it's right up yours. Let's see what time it is. 11:32. I'm going to keep rocking. I'm going to keep rocking for 10 more minutes, and then we will go into meditation and wrap it up.
The only institutions really were agriculture, church, commerce. You wouldn't really have contact with people outside of those pillars of life. So to join a fraternal order, much less an esoteric fraternal order, was a huge commitment. It opened a person up to a whole group of networks and contacts that he never would have found in church and farm life. And I think it's been difficult for some historians to understand the true depth of that commitment today and what it meant and how it made it easier for people like Washington and Lafayette to consort with and to be relatively open to the ideas of a figure like Mesmer. So when Manly Hall wrote that secret societies, Masonry in particular, kind of vouchsafed a set of ideals that took birth in the New Republic and that created an atmosphere in which people could freely engage in the spiritual search, I think his instinct was absolutely right. I think it was vitally, vitally correct. And I think while there were different forces and factors and complexities that contributed to this, and while that not every founding voice was involved with Freemasonry, particularly Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, there was a very, very clear and pronounced influence that it's very, very easy to miss if you don't know where to look. And Manly Hall really, truly knew where to look. And knowing where to look is a vital aspect of discovering the occult components of our own history. One of the things that I write about in the introduction to The Secret Destiny of America is the relationship between Manly P. Hall and Ronald Reagan, which is quite extraordinary and which has...
I actually never knew this. This is really interesting. We're going to keep rocking. I'm sorry. This is fascinating to me. I hope it's fascinating to you. Manly P. Hall and Ronald Reagan is a link I'd never even heard of.
Hasn't been really covered and written about much before. And
well, then that's why I never heard of it.
In the year 2010, I had been on a radio show in New Orleans, and after the show, the host said to me, "Hey, did you know that Reagan believed in this whole concept of hidden spiritual masters?" And I said, "No, I didn't know that." And he sent me a newsletter from a right-wing congressman, which reprinted a little essay that Reagan wrote on the meaning of the 4th of July. And I later tracked this essay down to a July 4th, 1981 issue of Parade magazine, which had approached Reagan early in his first term and asked him to write a personal essay on what the 4th of July meant to him. And actually, Reagan had written this essay in longhand on a yellow legal pad at Camp David, and then submitted it, as asked, to Parade magazine. And as I was reading this essay, I was absolutely shocked, because I started to recognize certain ideas and language and phraseology that came directly from the writings of Manly P. Hall.
I know exactly what that feels like.
I was completely blown away. And in this little essay of his, Reagan tells a story that appeared in the work of Manly P. Hall in its earliest form in Secret Teachings of All Ages, and later repeated in Secret Destiny of America, in which Manly tells the story of there being this mysterious speaker at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And
that's the story I read you guys yesterday before we started, right out of Secret Teaching.
Hall in Philadelphia, the delegates were debating over whether to sign the Declaration. And they were very conflicted over this, because they thought, well, if we go to war with the Crown and we lose, anybody's name who's on this document is going to be hanged. So they were kind of wavering. And the story that Manly tells is that this mysterious man suddenly rose from the galley, and nobody knew how he had gotten into the locked room past the armed sentries, and he gave this rousing address that told everyone, if you sign this document, you're going to be performing one of the great acts of human liberty in history. And he spoke with such appeal and in such a magnetic way that the wavering delegates at the end of his speech all rose to their feet and rushed forward to sign the document. And then after the ruckus had died down, they looked to thank or congratulate the unknown speaker, and he had vanished from the locked room, and no one knew where he came from. And Manly asked, was this a member of the secret order who had sent one of their emissaries to buck up the spirits of the wavering delegates? And Reagan, who had a taste for mythology, was very turned on by this story. And I discovered that he had been retelling this story in speeches going back to his earliest political career, when he was a spokesman for General Electric.
Wow.
And he continued to tell it up through his presidency, including a televised speech that he gave for the centenary of the Statue of Liberty, which was broadcast literally to millions of people. And I'm going through these documents, and dead to rights, there is the phraseology of Manly P. Hall. Actual phrases and terms that Manly used, specifically going
what we would definitely call biting today,
back to the Secret Destiny.
Because he's not quoting him. He's just openly plagiarizing him.
Of America. And the earliest passage from Secret Destiny is reprinted in this anthology.
But to be honest, Manly was at a level where he definitely didn't give a shit. He was pleased. If he knew about it, he was pleased by it.
And it's inescapable to conclude that Reagan had read this book. And I began to research and to look into it, and found that not only had Reagan retold this story repeatedly over the years, but our dear friend, Dr. Stephen Heller, who I think will be here tomorrow night, but he's speaking tonight at the Besant Lodge, so he couldn't be here. But Stephen shared with me a very valuable story, which appears in the introduction to the Secret History of America. Stephen was a fixture here on this campus in the early 1970s. And one day there was a big black stretch limousine parked outside of Manly Hall's office, and there was a uniformed chauffeur having a smoke outside the limousine, and a couple of state police just kind of mingling around the campus. And Stephen looked at this and he wondered, and he told me that he went up to the driver and he said, to who belongs this beautiful car? And the driver at first sort of hemmed and hawed, and then later said to him, well, it belongs to Governor Reagan. He's in meeting with Mr. Hall. And the next day, Stephen repeated this to a woman named Pearl Thomas, who at the time was the librarian and a good friend of Manly's. And she said, oh, yes, yes. The two of them are friends. He's visited several times, but we're not supposed to talk about this. And Stefan said that later on, when Reagan began to rise to national political prominence, some of the gang here on campus might be sitting around watching the news on television, and when Reagan would come on, Manley would chuckle and say, oh, yes, yes, we know him. And anyone who knows Stefan Heller knows that he is not a man given to hyperbole or exaggeration. So I take his testimony very seriously. And it matches up almost exactly with the timeline of some of Reagan's telling of this story. Because one of the figures to whom Manley had attributed this story was Thomas Jefferson. And roughly contemporaneous with the time that Stefan said Reagan was here on campus, Reagan gave a speech to CPAC in Washington. This was in 1974. And he again repeated the story of the mysterious speaker. And he said, this story was told to me by a man who's an avid student of American history. And he attributed the story to Thomas Jefferson. But I confess I never made the effort to research it or check it out. Manley was the only person who ever attributed the story of the unknown speaker to Thomas Jefferson. Different versions of this story have bopped around over the years, and I found what I believe is the inceptive version, which I'll tell you about, but Manley was the only one who ever attributed the story to Thomas Jefferson.
So if Reagan was hanging out with Manly P. Hall from the time he was a governor in California, which I guess is now a proven fact, that's pretty heavy to me. That means that, like, and clearly they were getting deep on it. Oh, wow. That really, wow.
His point where the story occurred actually was in 1845.
Wow.
It was in a book called Legends of the Revolution, written by a journalist named George Lippard, who was friends with Edgar Allan Poe. And Lippard basically conceded that the story was legend, that didn't really happen. But he felt that it did capture some of the more idealistic oration of the day. But Manley did take the story as solid fact. He repeated it, others repeated it, and eventually Reagan repeated it. There is a manner in which myth exposes us to our highest ideals. Myth exposes us to who we really are inside. And Gerald Ford made the interesting observation that Ronald Reagan was one of the few people he ever met whose public statements revealed more about the private man than did any intimate conversation. He felt Reagan was more disclosing in public than he was in intimate settings. So the fact that Reagan grokked to this story and got this story from the pages of an occult and esoteric philosopher named Manly P. Hall, I found quite remarkable.
That's crazy.
And it's a demonstration of how deeply some of these ideals can find their way into our public life out of view, out of view. Those of you who sat here for tarot readings sat with me in Manley's office, maybe in the same chairs that he and Ronald Reagan were seated in. That may give you mixed feelings. I have no idea. But it was an interesting facet of history. And one of the other facets of history, and there are many, that I think Manley touches upon in the writings and secret history of America. And I think this is a very, very important quality in our public life. And this sort of goes back to what I was having difficulty explaining earlier to the reporter from France and the translator in Shanghai, is the idea that reaching into the unseen, reaching for the ineffable, is not something that just belongs to or is the property of ancient prophets or people wearing vestments, but it is the property and the birthright of every individual. And I think in the best of our public life, not only is that something that we feel, but it's one of the reasons why alternative spiritual movements have flourished in America, have endured in America, and have often caught on very, very quickly. One of the figures that Manley writes about in the book was a very influential spirit.
All right, shall we play? I'm going to play it through, right? There's 15 minutes left. Let's do it.
Medium from the 19th century named Andrew Jackson Davis. And I think a lot of you, in a certain sense, will be able to see your own search mirrored in the life and the story of Andrew Jackson Davis. This was a poor farm boy who grew up in upstate New York on the Hudson River outside the city of Poughkeepsie in the 1830s, 1840s. And he grew up in a very poor, very hard-scrabble family that had a reputation, as did Joseph Smith's family, roughly contemporaneously, that had a reputation for clairvoyance, second sight, prophetic dreams, an interest in the occult. And Andrew, at a young age, at the age of about 17, got very interested in mesmerism, the work of Franz Anton Mesmer, the occult healer from Paris. And there was a circuit-riding mesmerist who came to town, and he would hypnotize people on stage so that they might do things like cluck like chickens or pretend they were flying, and it was really just a carnival show. And he called Andrew up on stage, and he wasn't really able to put Andrew into a mesmeric trance, or what we today would call a hypnotic trance. But days later, there was a local tailor in town who told Andrew that he too had been experimenting with mesmerism and would Andrew like to try again. And again, look at the lives, look at the background that these folk come from. A circuit riding mesmerist, a kid who grows up on a poor farm in upstate New York, a local tailor, and they're experimenting with mesmerism, not with anybody's permission. You know, earlier Greg was referencing the fact that Manly P. Hall, in a certain sense, was this uncredentialed guy, and that's true. He had very little formal schooling. He never went to college. In fact, most of the people I most deeply respect have never been to college. And there was this sense that permission wasn't required from anyone. A certificate wasn't required from anyone.
That is like a very European idea.
Experiments. And you can see that in the life of Andrew Jackson Davis. And so Davis consented to this local tailor that he could experiment on him, see if he could put him into a trance. And this time, not only did it work, but Andrew entered a trance that was very deep, that was very profound, and he emerged from the trance, and he gave, at the age of 17, these sprawling, epic metaphysical lectures in which he talked about principles of life from other dimensions, beings in the afterlife, life on other planets. And he laid out this whole cosmology, even though he was this poor kid who was working at the time as a cobbler's apprentice. And eventually, Andrew became known as a very noted spirit medium who could emerge from these mesmeric trances and deliver these extraordinary cosmic discourses. And the press began to jokingly refer to him as the Poughkeepsie Seer. But rather than rejecting this nickname, Andrew liked it, and he instinctively embraced it. And he started to become nationally famous. He moved to New York City in 1845, where he delivered these trance-based lectures, and people attended his lectures, including the short story writer Edgar Allan Poe, who at the time was writing a lot of stories based on the theme of mesmerism. And Andrew attracted a very important and prominent defender, a metaphysical minister by the name of George W. Bush, who was a first cousin, 4 times removed, from the Bush presidential family. And George W. Bush, at the time, was a very controversial figure because he had been
he said first cousin 4 times removed, because that's actually a pretty distant family member.
Presbyterian church. He was a Bible scholar. He left the Presbyterian pulpit and joined the Swedenborgian faith, which was a faith that was derived from the mystical writings of the Swedish mystic and scientist Emanuel Swedenborg. And Bush wrote a book called Mesmer and Swedenborg, in which he devoted a very, very substantial chapter to defending the visions of Andrew Jackson Davis. And Bush became one of his big supporters, and it was considered absolutely scandalous that this prominent minister and Bible scholar was defending the spiritual visions of this spirit medium from upstate New York. And Andrew, in his writings, which were voluminous, went on to put out a 4-volume book of spiritual philosophy in 1854. And in volume 4 of this book, he coined the term law of attraction. That's where that term came from in its earliest iteration.
Wow. Who asked about the laws of attraction the other day? Apparently there's only one, and this is the dude who, not this dude, but the dude he's talking about is the dude who wrote it. Wow.
It didn't mean a law of acquisitiveness. It meant rather that people who were seated around the seance table would attract spirits that had the same nature and qualities in the afterlife that the seekers around the seance table had in this life.
That makes
sense. As time passed,
sense.
law of attraction came to be seen as a kind of mental law of cause and effect. This probably started to take hold about 40 years later while Andrew was still alive. He lived until 1910. And I wrote an article, which is at medium.com, called The Man Who Discovered the Law of Attraction. And in that article, I include a photograph of the metaphysical minister, George W. Bush, and the president, George W. Bush, side by side, and they are the absolute spitting image of one another. It's absolutely uncanny.
That's awesome.
But George W. Bush is not returning my letters, so I don't know if you will hear further about this, but those were the roots of the Bush family in America. Now, I think the reason why Andrew Jackson Davis, whose name is largely forgotten today, but the law of attraction certainly is not forgotten. I think the reason why a figure like Andrew Jackson Davis and other figures, some of whom I've mentioned, some of whom are part of history, and you can read about them in Occult America, you can read about them in Secret History of America. Some of these alternative spiritual figures, these outsider spiritual figures, were able to attain fame and popularity and influence because they came from the environs of everyday life. And I think that they affirmed the best instincts in the American public that there is no certification, no permission, no bloodline, no approbation, no anointment required by anyone to pursue your own sense of personal inner meaning.
That's a whole word. We're pausing on ending on that. Yes. That's the whole word right there. Thank you, Mitch Horowitz. You guys still with me? You feeling this? Yes. Cool. Well, gang, let me take a peek. It's meditation time. We're still doing the heart meditation. We got a big old crowd up in here. Cool. What's up to Saya, Eve B, Freaky YOLO NR1, Aincrad X3, a bunch of new heads in here. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Andy WMT, Desiree, of course. NyQuil still chilling. Snow off the bluff as always. Well, let me pop the timer on. Deleting. Timer is 10 minutes. So, a lot of new heads in here. Welcome for the first time. We do a meditation for about 10 minutes every day. In order to do that, all you got to do for this particular one is sit comfortably, close your eyes, relax yourself. Try to keep your spine and your head straight if you can. Like, don't lean back too far if you can avoid it. And just focus on your heart. Focus on the feeling of your heart and the sound of your heartbeat. If you notice you have to breathe, just imagine breathing right into your heart, front and back and all around, and exhaling right out of your heart, okay? Just focus your attention on your heart for 10 minutes. It could be a life-changing experience, and it certainly will benefit you in a number of ways, as we've seen in all the research we checked out last week and the week before. So here we go. 10 minutes, we're focusing on our hearts. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy, as they say in my house. And as you get kind of tuned in there, to keep yourself from sort of trancing out on it, just count your heartbeats. Just keep counting. All right, we're back. I got my 7-year-old just off camera here, meditating for the first time. She's practicing. Like everyone here has been practicing we've been doing this 100-something episodes. Some of these people have meditated with us 100-something times. So you definitely get better with practice, right, guys? Would you agree? Let's see what they say. They're going to type in the chat over here. And we'll see what they say. It'll show up over here, too. He says it's awesome that you're here. Yup. And Nyquil, you never meditated before this, really, right? This has kind of been most of your practice and all that, right? He says, hello, little one. So, there you go, Bubba. He said most definitely. He tried, but he never got into it this good. So I can teach you too. We can, within 100 sessions. I mean, he's been good for a long time now. You don't have to do that. I think it helps people calm down a lot. It helps people be relaxed, feel comfortable in their bodies. Okay, so now we do prayers.
But I'm hungry. I haven't had breakfast
Well,
yet.
okay, so we do prayers for just 2 minutes. And then it's breakfast time, brunch time.
Can I just be like this?
Yep, you can just say amen at the end if you want.
Okay.
Okay. But for the rest of you guys who have your hearts all warmed up and tuned in, go ahead and feel your pulsing heart in your body. Center yourself in that. And feel the extent to which that field radiates from you. And feel how that field interacts with the other fields around you, of people and animals, plants, things, all creations and creatures, whether of God or nature or even of humans. Everything having its field of effect. And as we see these overlapping fields, it becomes a fluid of fields. It becomes an environment of energies, an ecosystem. An ecosystem we are part of, that we contribute to, and that we receive from. An ecosystem comprised and composed of causes and effects, originating with a first great cause, with the creator and the originator, that still reverberates on each level of effect down into ourselves. Let us give thanks. Let us feel gratitude in our hearts. Let us be filled with hope and with praise, knowing that we are one with this source, knowing that it pervades all things, knowing that even in adversity, it resides and it is placed there in communion and unity with us. Let us receive into ourselves the grace it gives us by its prompting and its direction. Let us understand the path it holds for us and embrace it joyfully, thoroughly, knowing that it is authentic, knowing that it is seated for us like a gem in a fixture. And seeing that, receiving that it will not be the same as any other gem in any other fixture. Though it is cut the same way, though it is shaped and sourced in the same place, every single gem in every fixture will be perfect to each other and none the less unique. Let us receive that fixture. Let us perfect our own gems. And let us present them in a crown of glory to the King of the universe. And may we all say, Amen.
Amen.
Well, I'm going to go cook eggs. I thank you all. I bless you all. I love you all.
Do we have time for eggs?
We got time for eggs.
Phew.
Bless you on your journey, and I will check you all tomorrow morning or before then on the Discord. By the way, some cool stuff on the Discord. I'm dropping more documents. I was up last night doing a ton of research, so it's all going up on there.